Chapter 1: The Village Elder. In a small, tranquil village nestled between rolling green hills and flowing rivers, there lived an old man known simply as the Elder. His name, though he had once been called many things in his youth, had faded into the background of his wisdom. No one really called him by any name anymore. He was simply the Elder, and it was a title that spoke of respect, reverence, and the depth of his years. The village itself was not much to look at. It was a humble place, with cobblestone streets winding between cottages made of wood and stone. Yet, there was something enchanting about the village, the way the air felt crisp in the mornings, the scent of wildflowers that danced in the breeze, and the peaceful hum of life flowing like the river that wound its way through the land. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the worries of the world faded, and people lived close to the earth. In this village, wisdom was treasured above all, and it was the Elder who was its greatest keeper. The Elder had lived many years, and in those years, he had seen countless seasons change. He had witnessed the warmth of spring blossom into the heat of summer, the harvest of autumn give way to the stillness of winter, and the endless cycle of life unfolding year after year. He had watched children grow into adults, and adults grow into elders themselves. Through it all, his heart had remained steadfast and open, a quiet observer of the ebb and flow of life. But he was not only an observer, he was a teacher, a guide, and a keeper of stories that span generations. Each evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the villagers would gather in the village square. The air would cool, and the golden light of the setting sun would bathe the earth in warmth. The people would take their places, some on wooden benches that had been worn smooth by years of sitting, others on the cool, soft earth beneath the large tree where the Elder always Saturday. There was something sacred about the gathering, a ritual that the villagers cherished. It was the time for stories, stories that carried lessons, stories that carried the wisdom of the past. Sometimes, the Elder would recount the great adventures of heroes and warriors from ancient times. He would speak of their courage and their struggles, of how they overcame insurmountable odds. Other times, he would share his own stories, tales of hardship and joy, of love lost and found, of friends and enemies, of mistakes made and lessons learned. His voice was calm and steady, like the river that ran through the village. Each word seemed to hold the weight of centuries, and the villagers would listen with rapt attention, knowing that they were hearing not just a story, but a lesson for life. But it was on one particular evening, when the sky was painted with hues of purple and gold, that the Elder was approached by a young man named Lukas. Lukas was in his early 20s, with a restless heart and a mind full of questions. He had grown up in the village, but recently, he had found himself struggling with doubts, questioning the old ways, and wondering about the truths that the Elder spoke of so often. Lukas had always been a curious soul. He had spent his youth exploring the hills and forests, asking questions that no one else dared to ask. And although the Elder had always been kind to him, Lukas had begun to wonder if the wisdom of the past was truly enough to answer the questions he had. The world was changing, and Lukas felt the winds of change stirring within him. The old proverbs that the Elder so often spoke of, those timeless sayings that seemed to carry the weight of the world, no longer seemed to satisfy his restless spirit. He needed more. And so, that evening, after the villagers had settled down and the Elder had begun to speak, Lukas rose to his feet. His voice was clear, but there was an edge of uncertainty in it as he addressed the Elder. "Elder," Lukas said, "why do we speak in riddles? Why do we share advice through short sayings instead of simply telling the truth?" The Elder looked up at Lukas, his eyes twinkling with the secrets of many years. The young man's question was not a surprise. In fact, it had been asked many times before, though perhaps in different forms. But it was still a question that deserved an answer. The elder smiled softly, his face weathered but kind, his long white beard flowing like the river's current. "Ah, Lukas," the elder said, his voice steady and warm. "You are not the first to ask this question. Many have wondered why we speak in such ways. Proverbs, my boy, are not just words. They are the distilled wisdom of the ages. They are not meant to be riddles or puzzles, but tools to help us understand the world, to guide us through life's challenges. They hold the lessons of generations that have come before us. And in each one, there is a truth that cannot always be captured by a simple explanation." Lukas stood still, his brow furrowed in thought. "But how can something so short and simple teach us so much?" he asked. His voice betrayed the uncertainty that had been growing inside him for some time. He had heard the Proverbs all his life, his grandmother had spoken them, his parents had said them, and the elder had shared them countless times, but Lukas didn't fully understand their significance. They seemed too abstract, too vague, for someone like him who was seeking something more concrete, something that could be grasped and held onto. The elder chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on Lukas for a moment as if seeing the young man not just as he was, but as he could become. Then, with a quiet wisdom, the elder began to explain. "You see, my dear boy," the elder said, "life is not as simple as it seems. It is not always clear, and it is rarely straight. Sometimes, the truth is not a single statement or fact. It is a path that we must walk, and the Proverbs are like signposts along the way. They are not meant to give you all the answers, but to point you in the right direction." Lukas listened intently, though he was still unsure. The elder continued, his voice soft but firm, like a gentle breeze that carried with it the scent of the past. "Think of it this way," the elder said. "When you stand on the edge of a vast forest, you cannot see the entire forest at once. You may see a tree here or a rock there, but you cannot grasp the whole of it. It is only when you begin to walk through the forest that you start to understand its depth, its complexity. The Proverbs are like the trails that guide you through the forest. They help you navigate the twists and turns, the obstacles and challenges. They remind you of the lessons others have learned before you, so that you do not have to make the same mistakes." Lukas's eyes softened as he considered the elder's words. He had never thought of it that way. The Proverbs were not meant to provide all the answers, but to help him find his own way through life. It was not about finding an immediate solution, but about walking the path with wisdom. The elder leaned forward slightly, his eyes twinkling with an understanding that only age and experience could bring. "Proverbs," he continued, "are born from the experiences of many lives. They carry the essence of our ancestors, the mistakes they made, and the truths they uncovered. They are reminders that we are not alone in our struggles, that others have walked this path before us and have left us guidance to help us along the way." Lukas stood in silence, his heart beginning to open to the elder's wisdom. He now understood that the Proverbs were not just simple sayings. They were the accumulated knowledge of humanity, distilled into words that carried with them the weight of generations. They were not meant to be understood in a single moment, but to be pondered, reflected upon, and lived. As the evening sky deepened into twilight, the elder's voice grew softer. "The truth, Lukas, is not always found in long speeches or complex arguments. Sometimes, it is found in the simplicity of a single phrase. And when you understand that, you will understand the power of the proverb. Lukas sat down beside the elder, his mind whirling with new insights. The question that had once seemed so simple now seemed to have layers of meaning. He realized that the elder's words held a profound truth. The wisdom of the past was not something to be dismissed or overlooked. It was a living, breathing thing, carried in the words of the Proverbs, and it was meant to guide him through the twists and turns of his own life. And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Lukas listened intently to the elder's next story, understanding at last that the words spoken that evening were not just words, they were wisdom that would carry him through the rest of his days. Chapter 2: The Test of the Winds. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the stars were beginning to reveal themselves in the vast, clear sky. Lukas sat beside the elder, his mind still turning over the words the old man had spoken. The simplicity of the elder's wisdom had struck him deeply, but there was still a lingering uncertainty. Though he now understood that proverbs were not meant to be immediate answers, Lukas struggled to grasp how such simple lessons could apply to the complexity of his own life. His thoughts were interrupted by the elder's gentle voice. "Come with me," the elder said, his tone calm, yet inviting. "There is something I must show you." Lukas looked up, surprised, but nodded and followed. The elder rose slowly, his weathered body moving with a quiet dignity, as if the weight of years had made him move with an unhurried grace. The two of them began to walk, leaving the warmth of the village square behind. The path was familiar, one Lukas had walked many times before, but tonight it felt different. The air seemed cooler, the night deeper, and a sense of anticipation lingered in the quiet that surrounded them. As they walked through the village and beyond, the quiet sounds of the night, the distant rustle of leaves, the soft murmur of the river, set the stage for the lesson Lukas was about to receive. The elder spoke softly, as though each word carried the weight of the journey they were undertaking. "There is a saying," the elder began, "the winds of change cannot be stopped, but they can be guided. When I was younger, I did not understand this. But now, I do." Lukas listened carefully. The elder's voice was soothing, yet it held an unmistakable gravity, as if the words themselves had been honed by years of experience. The wind stirred the trees around them, and Lukas could feel the chill of the evening air against his skin. The saying was simple enough, but it echoed in his mind, leaving behind questions he wasn't sure how to ask. "What do you mean, elder?" Lukas asked, his voice tentative. "How can you guide the wind? Isn't it beyond control?" The elder paused for a moment, considering the young man's question. Then he turned to Lukas with a knowing look in his eyes, his lips curving into a smile. "Come," he said. "Let me show you." They continued on, walking out into the surrounding hills. The land was open and vast, the ground rising and falling in gentle slopes. The night was alive with the sound of the wind moving through the grasses and trees. The air felt fresh and full of life, but there was something else, something more that Lukas could not quite put his finger on. After some time, they reached the crest of a hill. The view was breathtaking. From this height, Lukas could see the entire valley spread out before him. The river wound its way through the landscape, its silver waters glistening in the moonlight. The trees, though scattered, formed clusters that looked like green islands in the sea of earth. But what drew Lucas's attention most was the wind. The wind swept across the valley in steady gusts, rustling the leaves of the trees, bending the tall grasses, and shifting the clouds in the sky. It was powerful and relentless, a force of nature that seemed impossible to contain. The elder walked to the edge of the hill, his steps deliberate but unhurried, and stood there, looking out across the valley. He turned to Lukas and gestured toward the horizon, where the wind moved in waves across the landscape. The wind, the elder began, his voice calm, is like life. It moves, shifts, and changes. You can't stop it, just as you can't stop the passage of time. It is ever moving, always in motion, and it will not wait for you to catch up. Lukas stood beside the elder, watching the wind's influence on the land. The tree swayed gracefully in its embrace, their branches bending and twisting in response to its force. The wind was strong, unstoppable in its path, and Lukas felt the weight of its presence in the air. "But what can I do?" Lukas asked. "The wind is so strong. It seems impossible to control. How can I guide something so wild and uncontrollable?" The elder smiled, his eyes sparkling with the wisdom of many years. He turned to face Lukas fully now, his posture relaxed, yet somehow full of purpose. "Exactly," he said with a chuckle. "And that is where wisdom lies. You cannot control the wind, just as you cannot control every aspect of your life. You cannot change its course, nor can you stop it from blowing. But the wise know when to bend with the wind, when to stand firm, and when to change direction." Lukas looked at the elder, his brow furrowed in thought. "But how can I know when to do those things?" he asked. "How do I know when to bend or when to stand firm?" The elder turned to look at the trees again. He watched them sway in the wind, their branches moving with grace, their trunks remaining steady and unyielding. "The trees," the elder said softly, "are wise teachers. They do not fight the wind. They bend with it when it is gentle, and they stand firm when the gusts grow fierce. But they do not break. They know that the wind is a part of the natural order, just as the seasons are. And they know that the wind can carry them to places they could not have reached on their own. But the wind must be respected, not resisted." Lukas nodded slowly, the meaning of the elder's words beginning to settle in his heart. He thought of the times in his life when he had tried to resist the winds of change, when he had fought against forces he could not control. He thought of the times when he had struggled against the current, trying to keep things as they were, fearful of the unknown. Perhaps, he realized, it was not the wind that was the problem, it was his resistance to it. "But what if the wind is too strong?" Lukas asked. "What if I bend too much, or stand too firm?" The elder smiled once more, a patient, knowing smile. "That is where the art of wisdom lies," he said. "Knowing when to bend and when to stand firm is a skill learned only through experience. There will be times when you must be flexible, when you must change your course to adapt to the wind's direction. And there will be times when you must hold your ground, when you must stand firm in your beliefs, even when the world seems to push against you." Lukas felt the weight of the elder's words. He had always thought of wisdom as something that could be learned from books or taught in long lectures. But now, standing here on the hill, surrounded by the whispering wind and the steady trees, Lukas began to understand that wisdom was something deeper. It was not something that could be grasped all at once, but something that was lived, experienced, and earned over time. The wind blew a little stronger, causing the leaves of the trees to tremble and rustle. Lukas watched as the trees continued to sway, as though they were having a quiet conversation with the wind. The elder's voice broke through his thoughts once more. The wind will always be a part of your life, Lukas. It will blow through the seasons of your existence, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. There will be moments when you will feel as though it is too much, when you will want to fight against it. But if you learn to understand it, to move with it, you will find that it can carry you to places you never imagined. Lukas stood silently for a long while, feeling the coolness of the night wind against his skin. He thought about the lessons of the trees, about the wisdom in knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Life, he realized, was like the wind. It was always in motion, always changing. And he could either resist it, or he could learn to work with it, to guide it in a way that would serve him, not hinder him. As they made their way back to the village, Lukas felt lighter somehow, as though something inside him had shifted. The doubts that had once clouded his mind were beginning to clear, replaced by a new understanding, a deep, quiet understanding that life was not about controlling the winds, but about knowing how to move with them. The elder walked beside him in silence, his presence steady and reassuring. Lukas didn't need any more words. The lesson had been given, and it had taken root in his heart. The wind had spoken, and Lukas had listened. And as they returned to the village, Lukas knew that he was ready to face the winds of change that lay ahead, not with resistance, but with a quiet understanding of how to bend, how to stand firm, and when to change direction. Chapter 3: The Journey of the River. The sun had risen early the next morning, casting a golden glow over the village as Lukas and the elder set out on yet another journey. This time, their destination was the river that ran through the heart of the village. The river had always been a central part of life for the villagers, its waters nourishing the land, providing a steady flow of life for crops, animals, and people. It was wide, deep, and relentless, its current powerful and unwavering. As they walked along the path toward the river, Lukas couldn't help but marvel at the sound of the water rushing by. The river seemed to call out to him, its constant movement echoing the passage of time itself. The air was cooler near the water, and the scent of damp earth and fresh reeds filled the breeze. Birds flew overhead, their songs mixing with the sound of the river as it flowed steadily on. The elder, as always, moved with a calm, measured step, his every movement slow but purposeful. He had a way of walking that suggested he had all the time in the world, even though time was something that was ever fleeting for the rest of them. Lukas walked beside him, his thoughts swirling with questions. He had learned much from the elder, but the more he learned, the more questions seemed to arise. And today, as they approached the river, Lukas knew that another lesson was waiting for him. When they reached the riverbank, Lukas stopped and gazed at the flowing water. It was more powerful than he had imagined, its current swift and sure, its waters churning as they moved forward. The river stretched far into the distance, winding through the land before disappearing behind a bend, its course unchangeable, its path already set. The elder stood beside Lukas, watching him closely, as though he knew the young man was reflecting on the river's meaning. After a few moments, the elder spoke. "Do you see the river, Lukas?" the elder asked softly. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable depth to it, as if the river itself were speaking through him. "It is like time. It flows forward, never backward. We can try to fight it, but we cannot stop it. Lukas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the rushing waters. He had heard the saying before, about time being like a river, flowing relentlessly forward, but today, it felt different. There was something in the elder's words that made him see the river in a new light, something that stirred within him, urging him to understand the lesson it held. The elder continued, his gaze steady, his voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom. Just as you cannot hold back the river, Lukas, you cannot hold back time. It moves on, whether you are ready for it or not. And there are moments in life when you will feel like you are being swept along by it, carried forward by forces you cannot control. But in those moments, remember that you are not powerless. You can choose how to move with it. Lukas turned his head slightly to look at the elder, his brow furrowed in thought. But how do we know how to live when time moves so quickly? Lukas asked. His voice held a note of uncertainty. How do we know which way to go when everything seems to be changing so fast? The elder smiled gently, his eyes crinkling with the understanding of someone who had lived through many seasons. He took a slow breath, his gaze shifting from the river to Lukas, and then back to the water. There is a saying, the elder replied, flow with the river, and you will find your way to the sea. Life, like the river, is a journey. You cannot see everything that lies ahead, nor can you control the current. But if you trust the course of the river, if you trust that it is taking you where you need to go, then you will reach the sea. And in the sea, you will find the peace that comes with knowing your journey was true. Lukas stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the elder's words settling deep within him. He looked at the river again, watching as the waters swirled around rocks, pulling them along in the current. The river didn't stop to question where it was going, it simply moved forward, trusting in the path it was on. The thought filled Lukas with a quiet sense of awe. The river wasn't fighting against the flow of time, nor was it resisting the current, it was flowing with it, trusting in its course. Lukas turned to the elder, his voice softer now, his heart more open. But what if we don't know where the river is taking us? What if we get lost along the way? The elder's expression softened, and he placed a hand gently on Lukas's shoulder. That is the part of life you must come to understand, he said. The river does not know where it is going in the way that we think of knowing. It does not see the entire course ahead of it. But it moves forward with faith, trusting that the path it follows will lead it to where it is meant to be. And so, too, must you trust that your journey will take you where you need to go. You may not always understand the way forward, and there will be times when the path seems uncertain. But if you stay true to your course, if you keep moving forward, you will find your way. Lukas looked at the river, his mind still turning over the elder's words. He had always believed that life required careful planning, that every step needed to be calculated and deliberate. But now, standing beside the river, he began to understand that there was more to life than control. There was a kind of surrender involved, surrendering to the flow of life, to the current that carried him forward, even when he couldn't see the destination. The sound of the river rushing by seemed to grow louder, filling the silence around them. Lukas felt a deep sense of peace settle over him as he stood there, watching the water flow. He was beginning to understand that life was not about forcing things to happen, but about allowing things to unfold, trusting that each moment, like the river's flow, was leading him toward something greater. The elder watched Lukas quietly, knowing that the lesson was taking root. He had always known that Lukas had the potential for great wisdom, but sometimes it took moments like these, moments of stillness and reflection, for a young man to truly see. The elder's eyes softened as he took in the young man's expression. Lukas was beginning to see that the journey was just as important as the destination, and that trusting the flow of life was the key to finding peace. "Remember, Lukas," the elder said quietly, "the river never stops, even when it faces obstacles. It doesn't turn around or try to fight against them. It moves around them, finding a new path. Life will throw challenges in your way, just as the river faces rocks in its path. But if you stay true to your course, if you trust in the current, you will move beyond them, just as the river moves past the rocks." Lukas nodded, feeling a sense of clarity he had never known before. He understood now that life was not something to be controlled, nor was it a series of fixed moments that could be dictated by his will. Life, like the river, was fluid, always moving, always changing. But if he trusted in its course, if he learned to flow with it, he would reach the place he was meant to be. The elder turned to him, his gaze kind and knowing. "Now," the elder said with a soft smile, "let us sit by the river for a while. There is wisdom in simply being present. Sometimes, the answers come when we stop trying to find them." And so, they sat together on the riverbank, watching the waters flow by. The sound of the river, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet hum of the world around them were all Lukas needed in that moment. The river, in its steady, unhurried course, had given him something invaluable, the understanding that life's journey was not about knowing every twist and turn, but about trusting the flow and moving forward with faith. Chapter 4: The Fire of the Heart. As the days passed and seasons began to shift, Lukas found himself changing too. The lessons of the elder, the wisdom carried in the simple yet profound Proverbs, had become a lens through which he now saw the world. Where once he had rushed through life with confusion, now he walked with clarity. He understood that the currents of life, like the winds and the river, could not be resisted, but must instead be embraced and worked with. Yet, even as his understanding deepened, there was still something in his heart that felt incomplete, something that longed for a deeper truth, a deeper connection. The elder had shared many lessons, but Lukas sensed there was one more truth that he had yet to grasp, one more lesson to be learned. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Lukas and the elder sat together by the warmth of a crackling fire. The air was crisp, and the smell of burning wood filled the night. The fire, with its flickering flames, danced in front of them, casting long shadows across the earth and making the world feel both vast and intimate. The fire's warmth spread through the night air, a comforting presence in the cool evening. Lukas sat in silence, watching the flames. There was something hypnotic about fire, how it moved, how it seemed to contain both life and death in each flicker. He thought back to the lessons of the wind and the river, and wondered what lesson the fire held. Perhaps, he thought, the fire would reveal the last piece of the puzzle. The elder broke the silence, his voice calm and deep, as always. "Do you see the fire, Lukas?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the flames. Lukas nodded, drawn in by the sight of the fire, the way it rose and fell in a constant, unpredictable rhythm. "Yes, elder," he said, his voice soft. "I see the fire. It is beautiful, but dangerous too." The elder smiled, the lines of his face deepening with wisdom. "Exactly," he said. "The fire is like the spirit of a person. It can be warm and comforting, but it can also be dangerous if it is uncontrolled. There is a proverb that speaks of this: the fire that burns brightest is the one that is tempered in the hearth. Lukas thought about the flames for a long time, watching as the fire crackled and shifted. The light it cast was warm, inviting, but also unpredictable. It could bring light to the darkest nights or destroy everything in its path if not carefully tended. There was power in the fire, but also a fragility. Lukas knew there was something deeper in the elder's words, something that connected the fire to the heart of a person. So, Lukas said, his voice thoughtful, "We must control our inner fire, then? We must keep it from burning out of control?" The elder's eyes twinkled in the firelight, and he shook his head gently. "Not control it, Lukas. Understanding it is the key. The fire within you is a part of who you are, your passions, your desires, your ambitions. It is what makes you alive. But like the fire before us, it must be handled with care. Allow it to burn brightly, but never let it destroy you or others. A fire that is uncontrolled can consume everything, but a fire that is tempered, one that knows its limits, can light the world." Lukas reflected on this, the depth of the elder's words sinking in. He had always thought of his own passions, his desires for success, for knowledge, for recognition, as things that needed to be fully expressed, fully realized. He had often chased after them without thinking of the consequences, without considering if those desires were leading him toward something good or something dangerous. Like the wind, like the river, Lukas had been swept along by his own ambitions, sometimes with little understanding of where they were taking him. How do we know when our fire is burning too brightly? Lukas asked. How do we find balance? The elder's gaze was steady, and he took a slow, deliberate breath, as though considering the right words. It is not always easy to see when the fire is burning too brightly, Lukas. At times, the heat feels good, and we may think that we can keep stoking the flames. But, like the fire, when it becomes too intense, it will burn out of control. You must listen to your heart. When your desires overwhelm you, when they cloud your judgment or harm others, it is time to step back and find balance. Just as the fire needs the hearth to burn in a controlled way, so too must you find a way to channel your energy, your passions, in a way that serves both yourself and the world around you. Lukas sat quietly, his mind working to absorb the wisdom of the elder. It felt as if a door had opened within him, and he could see the path ahead more clearly than ever before. He thought back to the times when his own desires had pushed him too far, when his pursuit of something, whether it was knowledge, recognition, or success, had caused him to hurt those around him. His fire had burned too brightly, and he had been blind to the consequences of his actions. But, Lukas said, his voice tinged with doubt, how can we trust ourselves to know when the fire is too strong? How can we keep it from consuming us? The elder smiled gently, his eyes soft but filled with understanding. The answer lies within you, Lukas. You must trust yourself, but not in the way you think. Trust in the stillness that comes when you listen to your heart. Your spirit, like the fire, has a natural rhythm. If you take the time to listen, to reflect, you will feel when the fire is burning too hot. It is not about putting out the fire entirely, but learning to stoke it wisely, to direct it with purpose. Just as you would carefully feed the flames in the hearth, you must tend to the fire in your heart with care. Lukas closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire on his face, the steady crackle of the flames mixing with the stillness in his heart. For the first time, he understood that life was not about suppressing desires or denying passions, but about finding harmony between the fire within and the world around him. He realized that if he allowed his heart to burn too brightly without understanding its true nature, he would risk everything he had worked for. But if he could temper the fire, if he could learn to channel it with wisdom and care, it would guide him to places of greatness, of peace, and of purpose. The elder sat beside him, content to let the silence stretch between them. The fire crackled softly, and the night seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was waiting for Lukas to make his own peace with the fire within him. It was a quiet understanding, a moment of connection that transcended words. The lesson was not something that could be taught in a single conversation or in a single day. It was something that Lukas would need to carry with him, something he would need to practice, to nurture, over the course of his life. After a while, Lukas spoke again, his voice calm and steady. "I understand, Elder. I think I understand now." The elder nodded, his eyes gleaming with a quiet satisfaction. "Good. Remember this, Lukas. The fire of the heart is what makes life vibrant and full of possibility. But it must always be tended with care. If you learn to balance your passions, your desires, your ambitions, you will find harmony not only within yourself, but with the world around you." And so, Lukas sat beside the elder, the fire burning brightly between them, its warmth spreading through the night air. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows across the ground, but Lukas no longer feared the fire. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that to live fully, to live with purpose, he must embrace his inner fire, understand it, guide it, and let it burn brightly without losing himself in its flames. In the stillness of that night, Lukas knew that the fire of his heart would always be there, a steady, guiding force. And with the elder's wisdom to light the way, he was ready to move forward, no longer afraid of the fire, but prepared to let it burn in balance, bringing warmth and light to the world around him. Chapter 5: The Wisdom of Proverbs. Years had passed since the days when Lukas had first met the elder, and the once young man had now grown into a figure of wisdom and serenity. The lessons he had learned in the quiet company of the elder had taken root in his heart, shaping him into the kind of person others sought when they needed counsel. The villagers, who had once been his peers, now looked up to him as a wise man, an elder in his own right. His understanding of the world, tempered by time and experience, had become a source of guidance for the generations that followed. Lukas had inherited not just the elder's teachings, but the very essence of his spirit, the ability to see beyond the surface of life, to understand the deeper currents that move beneath it. Like the elder, Lukas had come to understand that wisdom was not a possession to be hoarded, but a gift to be passed on. And so, just as the elder had shared his knowledge with him, Lukas had dedicated his life to sharing it with others. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lukas stood before a new generation of villagers, young men and women eager to learn the ways of the world. Their faces were full of curiosity, their hearts open to the lessons he had to offer. They had heard the stories of his wisdom, and now they had come to hear the truth for themselves. Lukas stood at the front of the group, his back straight, his hands folded in front of him. The sun, low in the sky, cast a warm golden light across the gathering, and the air smelled of pine and earth. It was a perfect moment for sharing the lessons of life, and Lukas could feel the weight of the moment settling into his bones. As the villagers settled into place, Lukas took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady and filled with the calm authority that only years of experience could bring. "I was once like you," Lukas began, his eyes scanning the crowd of eager faces. A young man, full of questions, searching for meaning in a world that often seemed uncertain. "I sought answers in the wind, the river, and the fire. These are the things that taught me the truths of life, truths that have been passed down to me by the elder who once taught me, and truths that I now share with you." Lukas paused, his gaze shifting toward the distant hills, where the wind rustled through the trees. He could almost hear the elder's voice in his mind, as clear as if the old man were still standing beside him. The wind was a symbol of change, of life's inevitable shifts, and Lukas felt a deep sense of gratitude for the wisdom it had taught him. He turned back to the group, his eyes soft but firm. "There is a proverb that says, 'The winds of change cannot be stopped, but they can be guided.' You will face many changes in your life, just as the seasons change. You cannot stop them, but you can choose how to respond to them. When the winds blow strongly, when the storms rage, you must learn to bend with them, to move with the current of life. Stand firm when you must, and know when to let go. The winds will come, but how you face them will define who you are." The young villagers nodded, taking in the weight of his words. Lukas could see that they were beginning to understand the depth of the lessons he was sharing. He smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The wisdom that had once seemed so elusive to him now flowed easily from his lips, and he could feel the bond between himself and the next generation strengthening with every word. "The river," Lukas continued, "is like time. It flows forward, never backward. We cannot stop it, nor can we change its course. But there is a saying, 'Flow with the river, and you will find your way to the sea.' Life, like the river, is a journey. You cannot predict where it will take you, but if you trust its course, it will carry you where you need to go. You may not see the end of your journey, but if you stay true to your path, you will find peace. Just as the river moves toward the sea, so too does life move toward its own purpose. Trust the current, and let it guide you." Lukas saw the way the young faces brightened at his words, the way they seemed to settle into a newfound sense of peace. He knew that the lesson of the river was one of the most profound, the understanding that life's journey was not one to be forced, but one to be embraced. The current, like the passage of time, would continue whether they fought it or not. The key was to flow with it, to trust that the river would take them where they needed to be. He moved on to the final lesson, the one that had taken him the longest to understand, the lesson of the fire. He gestured to the campfire that burned beside him, its flames crackling and flickering in the cool evening air. "The fire," he said, "is like the spirit within you. It is your passion, your drive, your purpose. It can be a force for warmth and light, or it can burn out of control and cause destruction. There is a proverb, 'The fire that burns brightest is the one that is tempered in the hearth.' Your inner fire must be tended carefully. It is not something to be controlled, but something to be understood. If you let it burn too brightly without care, it will consume you. But if you nurture it, guide it with wisdom, it will give you light and warmth to guide your path. Find balance within your heart, and your fire will burn brightly, but never out of control." Lukas paused, letting the weight of the proverb settle over the group. He watched as the flames of the fire danced and swirled in the darkening night, their light casting shadows on the faces of the young villagers. He could see the understanding in their eyes, the quiet acceptance that life was not about avoiding the fire, but about learning to live with it. The fire, he realized, was the embodiment of life itself, both beautiful and dangerous, capable of bringing light and warmth or consuming everything in its path. It was a powerful force, and it was up to each person to learn how to harness it. Just as the wind and the river could not be controlled, neither could the fire. But, like the other forces of nature, it could be understood, and it could be guided with wisdom. The wisdom of the past lives in the words of the present, Lukas said, concluding his lesson. These proverbs, these simple sayings, hold the truths of life. They are not just words to remember, they are keys to understanding how to live in harmony with the world. The elder shared them with me, and now I pass them on to you. The winds will come, the river will flow, and the fire will burn. How you respond to them, how you live with them, will shape the course of your life. The young villagers sat in silence, their faces thoughtful, their hearts full. Lukas knew that the lessons he had shared were more than just words, they were truths that could guide them through the uncertainties of life. And as he looked out at their eager faces, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the wisdom of the past would continue to live on in the hearts of those who were willing to listen. As the fire crackled beside him, Lukas knew that he had become, in his own way, a part of the cycle that had begun long before him. Just as the elder had shared his wisdom with him, Lukas was now passing it on to the next generation. And in this way, the wisdom of the ages would never be lost, it would continue to flow, like the river, from one person to the next, lighting the way for those who came after. The wisdom of the past lives in the words of the present, Lukas repeated, his voice filled with quiet reverence. And through these words, we are connected to all those who have come before us and all those who will come after. And so, as the fire burned brightly in front of them, Lukas sat back and watched the flames, knowing that he had done what he was meant to do. He had shared the wisdom of the ages, and through that wisdom, the cycle would continue, alive, enduring, and eternal.